talk, you can still talk. Yeah, smoke them if you got them, but you can still keep
We're going to talk
talking.
about you when you leave.
Oh, all right.
Not about
It's pretty cool. Yeah. I'm not sure mine's going to be retired.
You've seen maybe better places.
I managed to get it all in pretty much by myself.
All right. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are very glad to have you here. My name is Jeff Giuliano. I am the Executive Director of French Colonial America, which is the private nonprofit that owns and operates the Center for French Colonial Life. This museum, the Bolduc House, the Mayor House, Hands-On Linden House across the street from that, and someday, very soon, especially if some of you have friends who would like to go, we own what survives of Francois Vallée II's house, just over on the other side of our parking lot. Now, that should be a familiar name to you. Why is Francois Vallée II important? Among other things, but particularly in connection with today.
You don't want me to say because I know.
She knows.
I've been cheating.
He was at the battle, a junior officer in the militia. And we have a portion of his house has survived, and we own it. We're going to turn it into a exhibit and interpretive facility. It'll take a little while, but that's going something that we hope to make happen before too terribly long. And we are very appreciative of you all being here today. We are, as I said, a private nonprofit, but we are good partners with the other entities here in town, like National Park Service, the state of Missouri, Felix Valley Historic Site, the Foundation for the Restoration of St. Genevieve, which owns the Jacques Debord House, the Learning Center, and all of these entities all tell different parts of the story. So we hope that in addition to visiting our site, that either on this trip or another one in the near future, you will come back and visit some of these other sites as well. This is a truly remarkable place with wonderful stories, not the least of which is this particular one. Okay, I'm going to inflict upon you the story that I have, that because I think a lot of you, some of you may have heard this before, but I want you to keep this in mind about why we are doing this. So, one of my previous jobs before I worked here was I was director of fire department in New York's museum at the time of 9/11. And our light duty guys that were at the museum, a lot of them responded. We had retired guys and cadets who responded. And one of my friends, a firefighter named John Germain, who was light duty, he had a health condition. They didn't make him leave the job, but he came to work in education unit. And well, John got permission to respond that day. And he made it. But he got hurt, he wound up in a hospital in New Jersey, and I finally got a hold of him. I said, John, I'm so proud to call you my friend, because, you know, you didn't need to go. You didn't like duty. Nobody would have thought the less of you if you hadn't gone. And he said, I was just doing my job. And then after a pause, he says, now you do yours. Make sure nobody forgets. That's really what our job is, and what Margaret's job that she has taken on, that she has chosen to do, is to make sure that people don't forget these important stories, these vital stories that tie us all together and should inspire us about how we live our lives. So, we're having fun today, but there is a greater purpose to this, and it is incredibly important. And for our final activity today, we have our friend, Dr. Bob Moore, who has been an incredible help to all of us, to this site, to a lot of organizations and sites around this region for a very long time, and we're pleased and proud to call him our friend.
Could I say something?
Well, I was about to say, and I would now like to introduce Margaret Carr, who is going to introduce Dr. Moore. Thank you.
The reason I got so involved in this is because I don't think we should ever forget the names of anyone who fought any of our military, anywhere, anytime. I had no one who fought at this battle. My 17 people from Daughters of the American Revolution that I have were all on the East Coast. But I've been fascinated with this battle since I knew about it. And that's how I met Dr. Moore. We were working primarily on the 250th of St. Louis, the anniversary of the founding of St. Louis. And I don't know if you remember this, but we were at a big meeting, and you said, and she is going to get what she wants, which is recognition of the battle downtown St. Louis. And we do have a wayside exhibit, thanks to you and the Park Service, down from the old courthouse. So it's my great honor. Bob Moore has helped me a lot. I really appreciate everything you've done. So it is my honor to introduce him as our speaker today for our commemoration. And thank God that says that, because I don't have it with me. Courage and Cannonballs, the Battle of St. Louis, May 26, 1780, Dr. Moore.
Well, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this story, so I was hoping I could present something that might appeal to people who may have never heard of the Battle of St. Louis, and also to people who are connoisseurs who probably know more than I do about the battle. So it's kind of a rough middle road there. First, I wanted to thank Margaret so much for inviting me to talk this afternoon, and Jeff for hosting us here. And especially they kind of moved heaven and earth so I could actually put on a program to show you visuals. Because originally I was going to speak at the church, and we wouldn't have really had the opportunity to see the images I'll be showing you, which help to illustrate the points I'm trying to make. So it was very, very nice of them to change the venue kind of at the last minute to be down here. So I thank you very much for doing that. I will have notes. I'm sorry to look at notes, but believe me, the program will go much faster and much more smoothly if I use my notes rather than just talk off the top of my head, because I'll talk about everything that I don't need to talk about. So I've only got a brief time this afternoon, and I think I wanted to let you know that a lot of what I'm going to talk about this afternoon comes from experience. This guy was me 40 years ago. I worked in a lot of Revolutionary War parks at the beginning of my career before I went back to school and got an advanced degree in history. And this was at Saratoga. I also worked at Yorktown. in Virginia and at Morristown in New Jersey, Fort Stanwix in upstate New York. So I had a lot of experience in the Revolutionary War period, especially the military during the Revolutionary War. So when I started to look at the Battle of St. Louis, I started to kind of apply some of the things that I remembered and learned when I worked at some of these other places to the events that occurred here in this area. So the main thing I'd like to talk about this afternoon is why I feel that the Spanish-led troops, which were composed primarily of French-speaking citizens militia from both St. Louis and from St. Genevieve, were able to defeat a far superior force of Native Americans in the Battle of St. Louis that occurred on May 26, 1780. I think a lot of the things that talk about the battle kind of gloss over this idea of, well, they were repulsed, and then they attacked people out in the farm fields. And what I'd like to talk about is why were they repulsed? Why were the Native Americans forced back from the lines that surrounded St. Louis? So let's talk a little bit about that. As I'm sure probably most of you know, the British Native American raid was planned by Patrick Sinclair, who was the lieutenant governor at Michilimackinac, and assembled by Emmanuel Hesse, who was a trader and former member of the British 60th Regiment. Sergeant Phillips of the 8th Regiment, British 8th Regiment of Foot, was promoted temporarily to the rank of lieutenant to serve as second in command of the expedition. The British loved three-pronged assaults for some reason, which always seemed to fail, as Burgoyne's did in upstate New York in 1777. But this was the original plan for a three-pronged assault that would all come together at St. Louis, and did not work out. Early reports reached St. Louis in the spring of 1780 that there were some 300 British soldiers who actually were not existent. It was mostly about 900 Native Americans who were in the advancing party that were coming to fight at St. Louis. In actuality, there probably were about 750 Native Americans and 24 fur traders and engagés in the force which was recruited to attack St. Louis. To this total was added some 200 to 250 reluctant Sac and Fox warriors who were convinced to join the expedition when the force reached their villages en route. By the spring of 1780, St. Louis was in danger of attack and possible surrender. Lieutenant Governor Fernando de Leyva, who was the Spanish official in St. Louis, had very few resources. His reports mention only 5 cannon, 2 brass or bronze 6-pounders, and 3 brass 4-pounders. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. Why do they call it a 6-pounder? That cannon must have weighed a lot more than that, but we'll talk about that. He had a garrison of only 15 soldiers and a drummer in St. Louis, and I've tried to graphically represent the numbers. So that group in the middle, that's the number of soldiers that were in St. Louis. And then he had a small number of soldiers at a broken down fort near the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers. There were just 6 soldiers up there. And there was also a lieutenant and 12 men stationed here in St. Genevieve, and they're in the front row. So those are the professional soldiers, the Spanish soldiers who were here in the area at the time of the attack. For the actual defense of the town, de Leyva would have to depend on the militia to augment these professional soldiers. The militia was composed of local civilian males between the ages of 14 and 50. The census of December 1779 listed 226 eligible males in St. Louis. And militia rolls listed 176 men and officers in what was known as the infantry company. And that's graphically represented here. This is how many soldiers they had in addition to the Spanish. And also a smaller group, which was a group of 48 men, 3 sergeants, and 3 officers that were in a cavalry unit. We don't know if they ever got their uniforms, but the uniform that was prescribed for the cavalry to wear actually looked like this. So we think of the British being dressed in red coats. The cavalry unit in St. Louis would have been dressed like this. Again, we don't know if they ever even got these coats. We don't know if anybody had time to put on military uniform when the attack came. But if they were out drilling and training, this is what they would have looked like. So
those were Spanish soldiers,
these would have been locals, French-speaking people in the militia.
militia.
Uh-huh. So these were just the local tradesmen, farmers, people who lived. Now, luckily, there was another group of soldiers who augmented this group, and that was the group from St. Genevieve. So we had the Spanish soldiers from St. Genevieve. We also had militiamen, and there were 60 of them who came from St. Genevieve at the request of Governor de Leyva. Took them only 3 days to get up there, and they were there just 3 days before the attack came. So this was really important to winning the battle. And you can see graphically there's a lot of soldiers there. When you see how long the trenches were, you'll understand why they needed all these people. Now the attacking force, and try to remember in your head all these pictures we've seen, graphic of how many soldiers there were. The enemy had over 3 times as many people as what we've just seen. So the enemy force was far larger than the group that would be able to defend the town of St. Louis. Now, the governor was disliked by a large share of the residents of St. Louis. The problem may have been that he was far more liable to follow established laws and precedents than previous governors had been. But he made himself even more disagreeable by insisting that citizens dig an entrenchment around the perimeter of the village and build a series of stone watchtowers in which artillery could be placed. It isn't known how much of this labor was accomplished by enslaved workers, but we have to assume much of it was, because about 1/3 of the village population was composed of enslaved persons at that time. It's important to look at these makeshift fortifications that were created in reaction to reports of an impending attack on the village. What did the completed Fort San Carlos Tower look like? You're looking at a sketch made of the tower by Louis Caleb Beck for a map, which was engraved in 1822. The tower was actually torn down 3 years before the map was engraved in 1819. But Beck, who drew this map, saw the tower before its demise and also platted the lines of the 1780 entrenchment around the town on his map. So for some reason, even though this map is showing St. Louis in 1822, Beck was showing the colonial era fortifications as they would have been in 1780 on top of the original map here. The entrenchment was gone even by a year following the battle, and they actually built a palisade wall around the town after that, starting in December 1780. It only lasted a couple of years before it rotted away, but they were quite worried about another attack on the village after the attack in May of 1780. So this map was made 40 years afterwards, and kind of gives you an idea that the whole thing lingered in the memory of St. Louisans long after the event. So the Fort San Carlos Tower, from the sketches we have of it, looked very much like traditional windmills in France, but particularly in Canada along the St. Lawrence River. And you see one of them here from Charles Peterson's book, This is a photo taken in 1939 of a French windmill, tower-style windmill along the St. Lawrence River. The so-called Roy's Tower, which was in St. Louis, seen here in a Thomas Easterly daguerreotype, was a windmill built in St. Louis in the 1790s on the shore of the Mississippi River, and for a time marked the northern boundary of the village. Later books often reprinted the image, either the photograph or an engraving of this tower, and confused it with Fort San Carlos. This structure was built as a windmill and not as a fortification, but it bore a resemblance in dimension and appearance to the fort. The tower itself was unfinished at the time of the battle, but apparently had platforms in place where DeLeyva was able to position all 5 of the cannon. The tower was placed on the highest rise of land on a ridge overlooking the river valley, and that ridge still survives today along 4th Street in downtown St. Louis. The old courthouse is built on top of that ridge. So if you're ever down there and you look, and especially it's more effective to be down near like where Channel 5 is and down near where getting down close to Union Station, and you look back down Market Street, and you can see how the land goes down and comes back up by the courthouse. So as far as we know, DeLeyva's the one who chose the site of Fort San Carlos. And it's a perfect site. It's like the highest piece of land. It commands both sides, both looking toward the north and west, where an attack might come by land, and also looking toward the river. So it's in terms of military science, it's an excellent location. And then people might say, well, why did they put all 5 of the artillery pieces in the tower? Why didn't you have some of the pieces, especially in the north end of the trenches that were dug, because that's probably where the attack would come from. I'll show you why in just a minute. When we look at the entrenchments, we see why DeLeyva made the villagers unhappy. That's a lot of soil to turn and throw up onto the side facing the enemy. But these trenches were instrumental in saving the village. Now just imagine, this is about almost 1.5 miles of trenches that were dug in just a couple of months before the battle took place. So they weren't working on these for years. This all happened very quickly before the actual attack came. My conjecture, and other people I understand don't agree with me, but my conjecture is that the trenches were dug in a similar manner to the way that they're shown in this period French engineering book. It's a top diagram, and that's a section view. So the trench is 3 feet deep, 12 feet wide, and has the 3 feet of soil that's dug out of the trench piled on the side facing the enemy, which goes up 3 feet. So then you got 6 feet of dirt thrown up there. So anybody standing in the trench, and these people, it isn't true people were generally shorter in those days, but a lot of these people were short. There's some of the figures for the Spanish military, there's some of the soldiers that are only like 4 feet 8 inches tall.
Wow.
I mean, short. So there were other guys who were just as tall as me, but it's anyway. That would definitely protect you if you were 4 feet 8 inches tall. And they might have put a firing step on the back side of it. What I was referring to before, I don't think they had enough time or the effort to be able to dig a ditch in front of the entrenchment. To me, that just seems almost impossible for all the, I can't believe they got the work done that they did do. This is a photo I took at a Battle of Yorktown reenactment back in 1981. And it shows a pretty good representation of what the trenches, I think, the trenches would have looked like around St. Louis. So you can see that kind of classic 12-foot area in the back here where the guys are standing, And then this is a firing step, which we don't know whether they built or not, but that could get you up over the top of the 6-foot lip of the wall, and then the enemy would be out here. So at any rate, that's my own conjecture of what they might have looked like. Now, one last thing about the preparations for the battle. Strangely, de Leyva posted 20 of the Spanish soldiers, his most experienced troops, around the Spanish government house at the center of town, where the women and children had taken refuge. They may have been intended as a guard of last resort in case the Native Americans broke through the lines. The 13 remaining Spanish soldiers may have taken on the duties of artillerymen in the tower. The attackers didn't expect to encounter trenches or a stone watchtower bristling with artillery. A splinter force, as we know, also simultaneously attacked down the river on the east side at Cahokia. So this is kind of an overall view of as the attack transpired on May 26th. The assault that was made on St. Louis came from the north and generally down the river, with several persons killed in the farm fields on the outskirts of the village and many people taken prisoner. I don't believe that the attack lasted all that long in terms of actual time, for the reasons that I'll show you in just a minute. So they probably came down, thought they could rush the lines, were repulsed, and then kind of withdrew to a distance where they were safe. So here we have a conjectural view of the battle looking to the southwest from near the old courthouse. And you can see the Fort San Carlos Tower on the very left-hand side of the painting. This is what we have in our Wayside exhibit that's in Luther Ely Smith Square. And this is the same view today. So this is looking in the same direction as the painting. And down there at the corner of Walnut and 4th Street is where the tower would have stood. So now I'd like to tell you why I feel the militia won the battle at St. Louis. A 6-pounder bronze field piece positioned in the Fort San Carlos Tower had a range of 1,200 yards with solid shot. This diagram, which is drawn to scale, shows how a cannon in the tower could place solid shot anywhere in the town or on the approaches to the town in any direction of the compass. Wow. So you see, those are the roads of colonial St. Louis, and it shows all the houses. And from the position of the tower, you can shoot way out into the common fields, way up by Shoto's Pond. You could shoot way over in the direction toward even where the Mississippi and Indian mounds were. So you had a field of fire that covered the entire town. That's why I said that de Leyva was so smart in making the tower at the point where he did. Plus, why did he put all his artillery in there? It was an elevated gun platform. They had the advantage of height over anybody that was attacking. They could see in all directions from where the tower was built. The inner circle shows the range of grape shot fired from a 6-pounder, which would be 300 yards in radius from the tower. So it's a much smaller area, but still significant, especially the amount of space from the tower. The visibility and field of fire from the tower gave the militia a real advantage in the battle. The bronze guns they used may have looked somewhat like this. Maybe not quite as fancy, we don't really know, but this is what a typical Spanish 6-pounder cannon barrel would have looked like at the time. And despite appearances to an experienced artilleryman, these pieces could be very accurate, especially at closer ranges. Here we see the solid iron projectiles these guns fired. Exploding shot at this time period was only used in mortars and howitzers. So this, as far as we know, was not used in the Battle of St. Louis. So these were not hollow balls with gunpowder inside that exploded. after a fuse expired or when they hit something. It was just a solid piece of iron. But these things could bounce around all over the place. They were very dangerous. And it would take off a leg, take off an arm, whatever it hit on somebody. Plus, there's accounts of balls just passing close to people's head. And they called it cannonball wind. And there were people who died from that, of a concussion, just from the ball passing close by their heads. So this was not something you wanted to mess around with. And you have to imagine Native Americans who may have never even faced these weapons in battle before, and what their reaction would be to having these solid pieces of iron being fired out at them. And this is what grape shot looks like. It makes the cannon into a giant shotgun with the smaller iron balls flying in an expanding pattern as they leave the muzzle of the gun. This type of charge was devastating to attacking soldiers. The type of infantry weapon that may have been used by Deleba and may have been issued by Deleba to his militia was this, which is the standard Spanish musket of the period. And there's a really wonderful replica of one upstairs in the museum. In fact, all this material I'm talking about is represented in the museum upstairs. So if you haven't taken a look at the exhibit, I highly recommend, because even you can see the 6-pound solid shot. We've got everything up there for you to see what I'm illustrating here. At any rate, the range on these was only about 100 to 150 yards. So we talked about even the grape shot could fire twice that distance. The attacking force would have been armed primarily with trade muskets, and perhaps some captured long rifles or military muskets. The effective range of these weapons was about the same, not much over 150 yards, unless they had rifled weapons, and in that case they could shoot up to about 300 yards. But in any case, the militia would have had cover in the trenches, so didn't have to worry so much about being hit even by a sharpshooter with a rifle. So in this diagram, the orange line demonstrates the effective firing range of smoothbore muskets of the period, about 150 yards maximum. And note how this is well within the radius for the artillery and its grape shot, shown in brown. So there would have been nothing that they could have done to attack the tower itself or the center of the lines. And if they were attacking on the north end of the village, attacking the trenches up there, not only did they have the fire that was coming from the men in the trenches, but the solid shot from these cannons, remember there were 5 of them, could be lobbed over the heads of everybody in the village, over all the houses, and hit wherever they wanted to hit out there in the fields where the attack was coming from. Attackers would have had to approach closer to the trenches than the 2 little figures shown in the picture in the lower left to have their shots hit the enemy. The area west of the tower had been cleared of all trees and was relatively flat farmland sloping up toward the fort and the entrenchments on the ridge. So the militia had the advantage of the high ground, a field of fire with no obstructions or places for the enemy to hide, a position offering cover from enemy fire, and the looming stone tower with its accurate artillery pieces. It's no wonder that the attacking force, after 5 hours and finding no advantage was to be had, withdrew. Upon finding that the enemy possessed all of the advantages, they must have stayed well clear of the firepower unleashed against them, for they only lost, and the accounts differ here, but a very small number of men, 3 to 4, maybe 1 man died later, so we're talking about a very small number of people in the attacking force who actually died. There were several that were wounded as well. So because they were frustrated, they couldn't attack this well-fortified position. Instead, they attacked people who were out working in the farm fields and picking strawberries on that day. The soldiers inside the fortifications felt a sense of helplessness as civilians were put to death before their eyes in gruesome ways, and according to DeLeba's report, mutilated before their very eyes. Dead villagers were found in the fields as far away as where Carr Square is in St. Louis today, and also Forest Park. Despite their brilliant defense of the town, the casualties outside the village were appalling. 18th century warfare was usually not this devastating to civilians. In 1780, about 700 people lived in St. Louis. In the Battle of May 26th, 22 people were killed outright and 7 were wounded, while the enemy captured 24 people and took them away. This amounts to about 14% casualties, killed, wounded, captured. As a quick comparison, at the Battle of Yorktown in 1781, Lord Cornwallis lost about 400 men as casualties out of his 8,000-man force, or about 5%, before feeling obliged to begin negotiations for surrender to George Washington. So typically in 18th century warfare, having 14% casualties was really, really high. Although he was ill at the time of the battle and needing to be transported from one place to another in a sedan chair, Fernando de Leyva did not abandon the watchtower. He said that he went to the watchtower. He actually commanded the artillery during the battle. He died a month afterward, and on June 28, 1780, he was buried in front of the altar of the parish church next to his wife, who had died the previous year. His 2 daughters, now orphaned, ended up in a convent in Spain, where they were supported with alms and charity. Without yet knowing that he was dead, the King of Spain granted a reward for the vigorous defense made by Captain Fernando de Leyva, 45 years old, and promoted him to lieutenant colonel. Lieutenant Francisco Cardabona, who was the commander at St. Genevieve, was promoted to captain. Royal Governor Bernardo de Galvez in New Orleans praised the valor and leadership of the men who were just below Cardabona in the St. Genevieve contingent, who were Charles Villet and Francois Villet II. And so, we mentioned earlier, it's important that the Villets were at the battle. They were the next line of officers just below Cardabona in the St. Louis battle for the militia. Without yet knowing that he was dead, I already read that, I'm sorry. I'll go on to the next thing. There were many heroes on May 26, 1780, but I attribute the success of the battle to one man, Fernando de Leyva, whose stubbornness and tenacity ensured that fortifications were built at the most strategic spot, and were occupied by a tower that, with its artillery, won the battle for the French inhabitants. And I guess as a footnote to this, I wanted to say that if the battle had gone differently, if the fortifications were not as strong as they were, if the tower wasn't there, if there was no entrenchment, what happened to the villagers outside the village would have happened to villagers inside the village. It could have been much, much worse than it was. So, of course, it was frustrating for the soldiers who wanted to go out and actually attack. And de Leyva held them back and said, no, stay within the fortification. And de Leyva was hated for that, and hated not just in 1780, for decades later. And there was this whole idea of calling him an imbecile. There was this so-called myth of the imbecile governor. De Leyva, for years, had all kinds of negativity heaped upon him, when, in fact, I believe it was mainly due to his efforts in stirring up the populace and spending his own money to finance a lot of the work that was done to fortify the village that actually saved so many lives on that particular day. So thank you so much. I'll be glad to take any questions if you have.
Bob, you used as an illustration architecture of that tower have followed the local pop vernacular concept of a tower, or would De Leyva have had a Spanish plan for a tower?
You might have. There's some towers in Malaga in Spain that are much like, what they built here.
So they were similar in the first place.
It could have been very similar. Or there could have been people in the town who, were familiar with the windmills along the river and were able to build a tower of that type.
Do you know if they had a 300, you said that they could go out a certain radius. Do you know if they had enough elevation for those cannons that they could had a 360 degree?
They absolutely would have, yeah.
They had
360 degrees. So anything that even come down the river, they would have been able to.
So there was a platform or something up on the...
We have to believe that there was something in place, whether it was it must have been the completed floor, because those are heavy, those guns are heavy. I mentioned earlier 6 pounders, that's the weight of what it shoots. But the cannon itself is very, very heavy. So to have 5 of them all up in that tower.
I wonder how they got them up there.
Yeah.
Well, they would have used block and tackle and had what they call a gin, which would have been a tripod structure on the top, and they would hold them up like that. So getting them up there wasn't as much a problem as it was, having the space for them. Because even to fire a gun, you need a lot of space around it. It's not easy. You can't put them, you could, but it'd be difficult, especially on the top of a round tower, to put the guns side by side like they would have been on a ship.
But how many levels were there inside?
Well, that's my conjecture, is that there were 2 levels,
Yeah.
and that they had because the back illustration shows that. He shows that there's like little windows. So I'm thinking that there was a platform on the very top, and there was one just below it. There was a floor below it. That's just a conjecture. We may never know.
Can you tell us the source of that painting of the civilians being killed by the Native?
Yes, this is from Karl Weimar's mural in the old courthouse. And you can't see them very well because when you're standing on the floor and you're looking way up in the rotunda, they're way up there. The only reason that you can see these pictures so well is because this is when the restoration work was going on. And I was up on the scaffolding and took these pictures. So you can see how detailed this is. He's even got, there's a basket of strawberries here, you see, and I mean, he's really showing, of course it's incorrect because he shows the fortifications there. Let me go back. See the fortification? So they did build a wall something like that after the battle in 1781, but it wasn't there in 1780. So anyway, that's supposed to be St. Louis all fortified back there, and then it shows the people.
What happened to the people that the British captured, the soldiers captured, the captives? What happened to them?
Some of them, somebody here may know better than me. I think some of them were set free when they made a counter raid on the. Is that correct? Did you know? I don't know if anybody here knows. I'm a little flimsy on that one. But I don't think they were put to death. I don't think that they actually died. But eventually some came back. But they weren't held captive for a while. But there were 2 raids. There was one not long after the battle where they went north, and I think they just wreaked retribution on the Sac and Fox that time. And then in the winter, in December, January, they made another raid and went all the way up to Fort St. Joseph, which is like where Gary, Indiana is today. And that's where kind of like the closest British fort would have been. And I think there may have been some captives there. They may have been set free, but they kind of burned that to the ground. When I say they, this is like the St. Louis militia. There may have been people from St. Genevieve who were in on that too.
So I think the St. Genevieve militia came back in September.
Came back to St. Genevieve?
Yes.
Okay. And they didn't participate in the later raid up on?
No.
Okay.
Because they were worried about Native American attacks here.
Sure. Yeah, makes sense. Wish I had better information on that. But I can look it up and send it to you.
So I have two questions.
Ah.
Were those cannonballs and grape shots reusable? Like when the battle was over, did
They
they
could.
go out and pick them up and reuse them?
Good.
And then,
Unless it banged into something and was out of shape.
and then I have an architecture book from about the 1920s, which shows a very similar tower north, kind of where the power station is in St. Louis. Do you know what that tower is?
That was the windmill, wasn't it?
It was Roy's
It was the
Tower.
windmill.
Yeah.
It was a windmill. It was never even fortified.
They did, I guess, kind of at the end of my time, they did build subsequently other fortifications around St. Louis that were towers, that were shorter. So there were 4 others that were built, stone towers. And there was also a wooden blockhouse that was built. So they did kind of cover the perimeter with other structures later in time.
In my book is a very similar building.
Yeah. Should I take any more? Or?
No. You go ahead and talk. I just want to give you something.
Oh, always nice to get something. Go
I
ahead.
was going to ask, some of the depictions show a wooden roof on it, but it doesn't seem practical. Does it not have a roof, the tower?
You mean that conical roof?
Yeah.
Well, the back drawing shows the conical roof, so I think they may have added that later. I don't think they probably had that in place during the battle.
And the other thing is, do we know where the St. Genevieve guys were? Were they on the north wall, the trenches, or the south?
We don't. We just thank God they were there.
Yeah,
You know, it really, in some ways, it doesn't even matter where they were because the attack really could have come from anywhere. So even the poor guys that were like in the southern part of the town, down in Choteau's Landing, you know, down where the factories are today, you know, they needed to be there. And I can't imagine how strung out they were for that long a distance.
No people.
Right. So to try to, you know, stretch the number of people you have and put them in the right positions would have been very difficult. So I don't know where they were positioned. I wish we knew so much more about the battle, but we just don't have that detail.
I just want to thank you and give you this, and people can talk to you.
Okay.
But I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Keep asking, but I just want to make sure you know.
Can I ask questions?
So, I had a quick
Go ahead.
question. So the St. Genevieve milice were supposed to bring 2 swivel cannons with them, swivel guns. Did you find any reference where those were at?
I didn't, but that would have been great.
Yeah.
That would have augmented, especially if they were at the north end, it would have been great to be able to cover that space better. And they could fire probably smaller grape shot or a lot of lead balls out of one of those, so it would have been great.
Judge Curran, who was one of the derogatory guys
Right, against
about the
the
labor,
labor.
said that the St. Genevieve militia were in the attic of the headquarters with Will. I mean, he was not very complimentary about us.
But about St. Genevieve, he said that?
Yeah.
I can't believe that would be true. I mean, DeLeva put his Spanish regulars around that house. There were a lot of things that once I kind of made that 3D computer program of the village, and once you do that and you have the topography in there and everything, you start to see things a little differently because 3-dimensional instead of 2-dimensional like in a plan. So some of the things they say about the battle just don't ring true. You know, it's especially there's things like they say that the attacking force on the east side of Mississippi fired their guns and the balls rattled on the roofs of the houses in St. Louis. It wouldn't be possible.
No.
I mean, to fire across the Mississippi River
No.
with the kind of weapons they had at the time, and for that to happen. They also talk about the Indians firing down on the trenches. And the only place I could figure that could be possible would be where the Native American mounds were built. And if they'd gotten to the top of, but most of those mounds were not very tall. So even that seems a little far-fetched. So, I don't know. To me, you know, when I applied what I'd learned at the different military parks I'd worked at, of dealing with the Revolutionary War, to the battlefield topography that I saw, this is what occurred to me as I looked at it. That here we've got somebody who really knows military strategy and was able to put, that knowledge into effect and make a very effective defense against a very large attacking force of people.
So were these fortifications similar to the other ones you're familiar with in the Northeast? I'm kind of thinking about the Battle of New Orleans too. Did Andrew Jackson put a trench in below New
I
Orleans?
believe he did, and then they had Cottondales or something, didn't they?
So this is a very normal thing that was done, or
Well, yeah.
or was he very clever and advanced
No,
to do this?
nothing like that. No, the book I showed was a pretty standard reference that a lot of military men would have had at the time. So this is from the book that was published in Paris in 1757, and there would have been a lot of diagrams like this. That would have shown all manner of things of how to build fortifications, and it was, pretty standard the way that they were done.
So was St. Louis the furthest north area of like a center of commerce along the Mississippi River at that time?
Well, there would have been several. I mean, St. Genevieve was certainly very important too.
Yeah.
And different products coming out of St. Genevieve, like lead and salt down here. St. Louis had established itself as a fur trading area, and so it was very strong in the fur trade. And one of the reasons why I think a lot of the Native Americans and the British were not happy with St. Louis is because they were taking a lot of the trade away, especially in the mid-Mississippi River Valley, even on the so-called British side of the river, over in Illinois, Indiana. Laclede, initially in the 1760s, had taken a lot of that trade away. So the British were talking about, it's really interesting to read what the British were writing at the time about their thoughts, this being before the Battle of St. Louis, before the Revolutionary War. They were actually talking about establishing a city of their own, a village of their own, at the confluence of across from the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers. And Benjamin Franklin even was involved in the correspondence on that and said, if you build a village there, I'll contribute to it.
Oh.
So it was this whole idea of we've got to have a counterweight. They've created, the French and their Spanish rulers have created this new depot of the fur trade on the west side of the river that's kind of sucking up all the oxygen as far as the fur trade goes in the middle Mississippi River Valley, and so the British felt they needed a counterweight, so especially so they could try to win back the tribes in Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio River Valley. So.
Do they know what tribes were involved in the Indian forces of the attack?
Yeah, it was on one of my slides here. I put that one up so you can actually read. And upstairs in the exhibit, there's an excellent thing to look at that gives you a lot of the background information, if I can find this thing. But I do have a slide that's here they go. So the Dakotas, Winnebagos, Ottawas, Iowas, a lot of these are actually the Anglo names for the tribes, so I know that some of these names are actually different today when we follow what the native people prefer to have their tribes called.
It would seem that the majority of them came from north and east.
Much further north, much further
Because I
north.
recognize like the Meskwaki and the Potawatomi
Right.
coming up from Iowa.
Right, and a lot of the tribes were used to dealing with the British, who, the French had lost the so-called French and Indian War, and so a lot of the French traders actually worked for British companies by this point in time. So the British were running things out of Montreal for the most part, and they had traders out as far as North Dakota, at the time. So, there were fur traders working throughout Canada and into the Dakotas, and throughout, Michigan and Wisconsin, and all those were taking furs back to Montreal. And so the other part of that trade was, below Chicago, and they were losing that part of the trade, so they weren't happy about that. That's why there were French fur traders who were part of the attacking force.